Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. In this episode, I'm very happy to bring the conversation I had with Clay Routledge. Clay is an existential psychologist, writer, and consultant. He is vice president of research and director of the Human Flourishing Lab at Archbridge Institute. He has published more than 100 academic papers, co-edited 3 books, authored 3 books, and received numerous awards for scholarly research and student mentorship. And he is the author of the most recent book, Past Forward: How Nostalgia Can Help You Live a More Meaningful Life. And that's what we talk about in the conversation. We start by talking about how we define nostalgia, what it means, what it is, what it isn't. Nostalgia being forward thinking, which sounds kind of counterintuitive, but Clay's got a really nice way of conceptualizing and thinking about it. Nostalgia with positive and negative memories, and the downsides of nostalgia and pop culture. This is a fun conversation, and on this bit of it with pop culture, we spend a good amount of time there. Obviously, we make plenty of pop references and stuff, but I push back a little bit on this because I think that nostalgia has definitely some negative aspects, and I don't think Clay disagrees with that, but we have a really nice exchange, and again, kind of pulling at this concept with nostalgia and what it looks like. And he was just so gracious and so wonderful in this bit of the conversation. And it really is just a conversation. It really feels that way. And he's absolutely wonderful. So I really, really enjoyed that part of it. We also talk about nostalgia with self-concept, self-continuity, and self-esteem. Again, here I give a little pushback, self-esteem and what it is in the literature and what we know it's not now. And again, he was super generous with his ideas and really gracious with how he accepted some of my pushback. So he was just really, really lovely. We talk about nostalgia for understanding existential anxiety and death, best ways to use nostalgia, and many more topics. I can't say enough good things about this conversation and about Clay himself. He's really a wonderful human being, super, super brilliant, really, really good thinker. And I really, really enjoyed this conversation. He's somebody I wish I could talk to more often on the podcast. Get him here once a month. He was just really, really wonderful. I really enjoyed this conversation. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube. Get over there, subscribe, like, follow, tell your friends. Check out some of the other episodes I've done. See what other topics you may find interesting. And continue listening to all the ones coming out. So now I bring you Clay Routledge. I'm here with Clay Routledge. Clay, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to speaking with you.
Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. We were just talking before we started that we've been mutuals probably online for who knows how long, but both of us are becoming more and more offline, which is probably a good thing. And right. And so you've written a great book, which I greatly enjoyed. It's a really easy read, but also it's nice because there's obviously you can tell there's the research and a lot of like scientific studies in there, but just a really nice kind of digestible way of getting that. It's not too sciencey, which was really nice. And the book is called Past Forward: How Nostalgia Can Help You Live a More Meaningful Life. Great title, by the way. And
thank you.
So nostalgia is what we're going to be talking about. It's before we get into all that, tell listeners just kind of who you are professionally, academically, and some of the things you currently do.
Yeah. So I'm what's called an existential psychologist by training. I did my PhD in social psychology and with the focus area on, what it is that makes humans a uniquely existential species capable of asking big questions about the nature of our existence, the meaning of our lives, and how that influences our goals, our priorities, our well-being, and all of that. So I was a professor for many years, 17 years, in this psychology department, and then ultimately in a business school. And then more recently, I've left academia, and I am now the director of the Human Flourishing Lab at the Archbridge Institute, which is a nonpartisan think tank that studies both like and sort of promotes both the kind of economic and social cultural psychological ingredients to human flourishing. So as a psychologist, I'm very much focused on the psychology side of things there. And what I'm really interested in is how to help people live more fulfilling, more meaningful lives in which they're able to reach their full potential and really flourish. And so I'm doing a lot of the same stuff I did as a researcher in academia, but now more public facing, more geared towards directly interacting with the public as opposed to doing more like scientific writing and academic journals and things like that. So it really makes me happy that you noted that the book was an easy read, because it seems like it would be easier to write an easy read book, but as someone who spent most of his career writing empirical journal articles and editing these types of scholarly books, I actually found it fairly difficult to do that. So that's something that I'd be excited about in my sort of new career path, is really moving away from things for other scholars to read and trying to do more things for like regular people to read. So I appreciate that.
Yeah,
you found it fairly accessible.
I haven't written a book yet. People have asked me if I'm writing one, and I'm not. But I'm not inspired, I guess, to write on any one thing in particular yet. I don't know. It'll come to me. But I have written a few pieces like for like a public audience, and it's just like I don't know. Like I feel like I don't know how to write in English when I do that. I'm just like, I don't know. I like I got a PhD. I wrote a dissertation. I wrote papers. I'm like published, but it's just like I don't. Nobody taught me how to write this way. I don't know how to write this way. Like this is so foreign to me. I ask all my friends that do like creative writing or they masters in writing, and it's just like, can you tell me how to write? I don't know how to do this. So, but you did a great job, though. You did a great job.
I think we write how we think. And so, like, if you think about things in really nuanced, complex ways, and you're really interested in understanding, like, evidence and big ideas and processes and, all of those things, like, that tends to come out, I think, in the way you put, pen to paper. So I think it is hard to be like, well, how do I talk about this? How do I put myself in someone else's head, right? Mm-hmm. And like talk about an idea or explain an idea. And it's not like an intellect thing. I think dumbing down isn't quite the right way of saying it. It's saying, no, not everyone's nerding out on this at the same level I am, but they are interested in getting the basics from it. It's like, I go watch a movie on a topic that I'm somewhat interested in, like, I'm interested in this new Ferrari movie, but I don't want to read a Ferrari manual. I just want the high points of the story. And I think that's the trick, is like, most people, that's what they want from most subjects, is they just want to get the gist of it, and figuring out how to do that. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying I'm, necessarily very good at it. Some people are very, very talented at that, but I think that's the trick.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's right. It's just, how do people kind of get it? I would imagine also that, if you taught for a long time, teaching forces you to find, is like, okay, you're explaining something to somebody, a student or whatever, and they're not getting it. So you have to like explain the same thing in like 3 different ways sometimes. And then it's, that's okay. Now it clicks. Yeah. Teaching kind of does that for you. So I just imagine writing's sort of similar. That's a great point. Of doing that. Yeah. So.
No, that's a great point. There's nothing more humbling than the feedback from, the students falling asleep or checking their phones or whatever, when you think you're like laying down some wisdom.
Like, this is crushing right now. And then they're just kind of like spaced out. They're not even paying attention. Yeah. That's right. That's definitely something that happens. Okay. So nostalgia, you talk about this, you're writing about this, I guess. For me, nostalgia seems to be this kind of focus on the past, and you say that it's actually essential for progress and improvement, and that it's very forward thinking, actually. So maybe define for us what is nostalgia, or what's a good operational definition, and why is it very helpful for us to be have progress and very forward thinking.
Yeah. So if you look online at like a dictionary, you'll see a definition that's like, nostalgia is a sentimental longing for the past, or wistful longing for the past, which kind of gets at it. But that really emphasizes the affective or the more emotional component of nostalgia, that longing for, or even the desire, the kind of motivational component of it.
Mm.
But when we think of nostalgia, it's also worth thinking about it as the more like cognitive side of things. Like it involves memories, right? And so we have this feeling, the sentiment, yes, but then that usually conjure up memories that we associate with that feeling. Like we remember the good old days, as they say. And so I really think of nostalgia as like this this like combination, this cocktail of emotion and cognition, like our longing, like our desire, our wanting for particular, like to revisit particular memories. And these memories tend to be the memories that we find the most fulfilling or the most meaningful in our lives. Like you can be nostalgic about lots of things, and these memories can vary in how meaningful they are. But at the core of a lot of people's nostalgia is this sense of I've moved through life and collected all these different types of experiences. Some of them are really special to me. They really made a mark. They really helped me figure out who I am, or they really revealed something about me, or they reminded me of why life's worth living. And in those memories, we find particularly useful when we're trying to move forward with life. So another way to think about it is the past has already happened.
Mm.
The future's unknown, but we're a very future-oriented species, right? We have this capacity to think about the future, to imagine the future, which is very good for planning for goals. It's very good for progress too. Like, the reason we might care about like what society, the civilization is like for future generations is because we can imagine it. We can say, oh, maybe we would like them to have, nice things or a better life than us. But there's also all sorts of uncertainty associated with that. We all know that anything can happen tomorrow, good and bad. And as much as we try to control that, we know that, life can be chaotic and uncertain. And then even when we're making decisions, a lot of times we're not sure which direction in life to take.
Mm.
And so that uncertainty towards the future tends to make us look for some sort of both comfort, but also guidance. And so the past has already happened, so we can pull from the experiences that we found in some way like soothing, but also that we think could be useful. So it's like you might move to a new city and you might feel lonely, and I don't, how am I going to meet people? Did I make a mistake? Like, how am I going to go forward? And then, you can reflect on positive social experiences you've had in the past, and that, does a couple things. It pulls you out of the moment and allows you to be like, okay, this moment right now is not great, but it's just a moment. Life is bigger than this. I've had other moments, and some of those moments were very fulfilling. So it can help you take that perspective. But I think it can also provide you with very specific information about like, oh, like I've had to make new friends in the past. I've been in situations before where I didn't know anyone, and then I formed this lifelong friend. For example, and that gives you like the confidence that you can succeed in your new endeavors. So in a lot of ways, I think that's how nostalgia work. We're in this constant relationship between the life we want to live, the direction we want to take, the uncertainty associated with that, but also needing some guidance.
Mm.
And where do you look for guidance? You look to when it comes to your own autobiographical memories, you look to those special experiences that you think helped you become the person you are, or the person that you want to be.
Yeah, a lot of that tracks. I guess the one thing I'm curious is, do we tend to have a trait negativity bias, right? And how much are we? This sounds like a kind of double-edged sword, right? Like we can, when it comes to recollecting various memories, that we can remember, or we can be nostalgic for positive and negative memories. So how much does nostalgia help in certain ways where it's like, yeah, I can remember a really positive time or a really positive experience, something that was really, sentimental or, whatever. But then I can also remember like, it could be a trauma, or it could be something really negative. It could be something related to heartbreak or loss, things like that. How much does that also happen and maybe is less helpful for us if we're trying to, I guess you could see it from two perspectives. That could be less helpful in one sense and then actually really helpful in another sense. But this idea of negative and positive memories.
Yeah. So a couple things. One, we have this, what's sometimes referred to as the fading affect bias, where our memory tends to be biased towards negative experiences. The affective intensity of them tend to fade faster than positive experiences. So you can have something that, you can have an experience in life that actually had, a fair amount of negative affect in it, and you tend to forget, the intensity of that affect diminishes with time. It doesn't sting as much as time passes. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But the other thing is nostalgia is actually this interesting, like cocktail of, it's not purely positive memory. It's not just a happy memory. Oftentimes our nostalgic memories involved some kind of overcoming a difficulty, or it was an adventure. We went on this road trip with friends, and it was disastrous in a lot of ways, but we became closer. And so I think one of the ways that nostalgia works is, as time passes, our brains, have time to sort of make sense, weave together like a coherent narrative. And we like to feel like there's some sort of lessons from something. And so immediately after something, if you had a family event or whatever, and you fought a lot, and then immediately after you were like, yeah, there were some high points, but it was also really negative. Over time, when the emotion fades a little bit, you might be in a better position to be like, oh, like that, I learned something from that. So I don't think it has to be a purely positive experience for it to be a candidate for a nostalgic memory. But a key is, it tends to be an experience that is what's oftentimes what's referred to as follows a redemptive, emotional arc. So there might be negative elements to it, but there was a positive conclusion. And so sometimes, loss can be powerful. We can have memories associated with the loss that, make us sad, but also at the same time remind us of how meaningful that relationship was. And it's that, the ending with gratitude or positivity or whatever that tends to push it into the nostalgia column. So, people can have, that's to say, we can have lots of different memories, including very, very traumatic and unpleasant ones that oftentimes are sources of pathology, right? They're not the types of things that people really want to revisit a lot. But nostalgic memories tend to, be different from that. And they tend to be like I said, even if they have negative elements, they tend to have some kind of lesson learned. When I was at the University of Southampton, when I first started, some of the early years of doing this research, we actually collected a bunch of nostalgic narratives from older adults. Southampton was a city that nearly 90% of it was destroyed during World War II by German bombers because it was a port city. And so a lot of the people we were collecting narratives from at the time were children during that period. And they, surprising to us, because everything I'm saying to you right now is not what I hypothesized going into it. This is more of discovery than it was prediction. I wouldn't have expected that there would be so much nostalgia for these kind of traumatic time periods and experiences. But there was a lot of nostalgia for that time. And it wasn't because people thought it was great to be bombed, but, for their city to be destroyed by a German bombing. It wasn't because they thought that it was great that they were separate. Their fathers were all sent to the continent to fight, war. It was because they said, well, during that time of my life, we learned something about the importance of a family, or the kind of the nonsense of life was sort of shedded, and these kinds of experience really focus you on what's most important in life. And so these kind of defining moments, people often have nostalgia for, even if they're not, extremely positive.
It's very interesting, because at the end of the day, we have the past always kind of present with us, whether we're accessing it or we're not accessing it, which is very interesting. Now, I guess there's a few ideas here I want to connect, but sometimes I think that people can be too stuck. Well, two things. They can be too stuck in the past with this kind of view of, nostalgia, but also they have, a lot of our memories are inaccurate and they're fuzzy, and we remember things the way we want to remember them, not necessarily exactly how it happened, which,
Right.
you could debate, the importance of that. So there's that on the individual level, but I find that more recently, so this is a little bit kind of a branch off of the kind of central theme here, but you'll see where I'm going with it. I find that in our media, we have this almost this kind of, I don't know, pornography of nostalgia, right? Where it's everything is, the good old days of how we used to do things, so much that I think a lot of the times we're creating a lot of content, but we're creating less art. We're creating less things of novelty. And I think of this when people say the types of music they like, the types of shows they watch, the types of films they watch, or, things that are in kind of things that are popular or things that make a lot of money or things like that. I mean, of course, there's always a kind of niche, whatever. But when you think about things, whether it's, even in pop culture, there's this fascination with wanting to have a sequel and have a sequel trilogy and then a prequel and a spinoff and it's just all of these things. And it's like, look, like this was good. I don't know if I want another. I don't know if I want Top Gun 3. I mean, Top Gun 2 was great. But I mean, and the original was fine.
Is there going to be Top Gun 3?
Yeah, it was announced today. It's in the works, we're going to get an 8th Mission Impossible movie, which again, I mean, those movies are great. I don't dislike them. But I think about things like, people want, I feel like sometimes nostalgia can be a kind of security blanket for people to prevent them from growing. So for example, like, this is just an example, but like people love Friends. They love Friends. They love that show. People love The Office. They love that show. People quote it. People watch it 27,000 times. And that's fine. Like that, I mean, whatever. But a lot of the times these things become, well, when can we have like, another season of this? Or it's almost like they don't want things to end, or they don't want to try new things, and I don't quite understand it. I find it like it can really prevent people from progressing forward. I think they kind of get stuck there sometimes. Like, I mean, last bit on this, right, is, I mean, we're still hearing, Star Wars fans go on and on and on and on and on and on about the original trilogy. And don't get me wrong, original trilogy is great. Empire is the best film. We all know this. Like, that's fine. But like, people give me shit about this, but like the prequel trilogy isn't terrible. I mean, there's picky things about it, but story-wise, I think it's pretty good. But, when you watch, Force Awakens, it's literally A New Hope for 2015 or whenever it came out. It's the same story. It's the same thing. It's all this stuff. And I don't know, people complain about stuff, and it's like, well, why do you just want the same thing? Like, you have it. Like, you're not going to capture that. And if you take an objective point on Star Wars, I mean, I know it's big in pop culture, but I mean, it's basically a shitty B movie. Like, it's not good. It's not, the writing's not good. The acting's not good. The effects aren't good.
I'm triggered.
You know what I mean? Like, and I'm the biggest Star Wars fan. I've seen all of those movies a million times, and I love it. And I know what it is, and I know what it isn't. And that's fine. But they just don't want anything potentially off of that. They just want it to be what they want it to be when they saw it. And I can get some of this. Like, you want to create a memory. You want to create how you felt when you were 15 and you saw it the first time, and nothing quite gets that again, or whatever. But do you think that there's in general media or pop culture, or for where we're at, that this kind of obsession or fascination of nostalgia can be harmful is a little strong, but it can impede growth or creativity for new things?
So there's Okay, there's a lot of different.
Yeah.
I think I have a lot of different answers to that.
You like the original trilogy of Star Wars, though. That this is important.
I do.
Okay, that's
I
good.
do. I mean, I'm not like I wouldn't say I know people that have read the books, watched, adults that watched the cartoons. Um, you know, I'm not at the like played all the games. Like I've seen all the movies and I've watched, I think, most of the live action
Mm-hmm.
television series on Disney Plus.
Mm-hmm.
And I generally like, I wasn't a big fan of the three latest movies,
Mm-hmm.
but I won't nerd out too much on that. But I could articulate, why particular. We just watched. What's the most recent? We just watched the most recent show.
It'd be Ahsoka would be the most recent one.
Yeah, that. I liked it. But I'm just not that hardcore about that stuff. But to answer your question, well, one answer is not okay. This isn't a direct answer, but I think it gets to maybe helps explain why some of this is going on. So the irony of nostalgia and progress, and the concern you raise about like nostalgia as a barrier to like new ideas, creativity, innovation, those things, is like when the world is actually changing a lot, that creates anxiety. Rapid change, and that tends to make people nostalgic. So in a way, it's almost as if, maybe this isn't the best time for like Hollywood in terms of creativity, but there's other things going on in the world that are changing or causing a lot of like uncertainty and anxiety, whether it's political issues or the pandemic or the pace of digital technology change, internet, social media, and stuff like that. And something, because I get this question a lot actually from journalists. It's like, oh, are we in an age of nostalgia? Like, is this like all the stuff you said, and then they'll list a bunch of like brands that are, repackaging things to look like the old brand or bringing out old products and all these things, so there's all these indicators that seems like nostalgia is like going nuts right now. Now, I don't know if that, I'm not saying that's not true, but it's not like I have good data of like how nostalgic were people 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. So it could be like in our area of like digital technology and online culture, like it's a lot easier to really generate a lot of and share a lot of nostalgic content. And maybe before television, people were like sharing the same stories over and over. Or, maybe there wasn't I don't know how to compare like how original content was before compared to now and how nostalgic people were. So that relationship, I'm totally sure. But what I do know from our research is when people feel like the world is changing a lot, particularly in ways that make them anxious, their interest in consuming nostalgia certainly goes up. And so it could be, you're right, that like it could be like, production companies are like, wow, like the audiences really want, like the movies that are really doing well are these like sequels. And so we should, just from an economic point of view, like we should fund those, like we should make those because that seems to be what the market demands. That could certainly be true. But another point I'll make around that is those are like sort of the obvious examples of like prepackaged nostalgia. It's like, oh, we're going to release a new Star Wars. But if you take a deeper look at things that you actually find to be very, very creative or like taking something in a new direction or very innovative, oftentimes there's they're nostalgic too, or there's a very much more subtle and well utilized form of nostalgia. So a lot of musicians will talk of like even musicians that we think are doing something really fresh. They have their nostalgic memories for what got them into that music, and they want to pay tribute. They'll work in a little hook, or they'll work in something that's like, this is a nod to this person who influenced me. And that's probably been the case throughout the history of art, right? Throughout the history of culture is I'm taking something that really inspired me when I was young, and I'm making it more relevant, more fresh, trying to take it in a new direction. So that fusion of like tradition with innovation, I think is where nostalgia is kind of at its best. Um, but I share your like criticisms of a lot of like the content we see, that it really just seems like it's just like it's a very simplistic nostalgia. It's like, oh, people just want people just want another Star Wars movie, and then they want to complain about it because it wasn't as good or whatever. That's, I've done some consulting work with companies on nostalgia, and one of the things I say is it's like nostalgia can be a very, very powerful tool. But it's a dangerous one too, because you have to get it right. Because like if you anger the diehards, like we were talking about the Star Wars people, it's very, very, people who are the hardcore fans are very, very hard to please. So it's like when you activate nostalgia, can really bring them out for sure. But then you're dealing. It's like you're dealing with something sacred. Like you have to do it right. That's hard.
You kind of are, because that's your memory. Like people not only have their like memory, but they have their like memory in time. So this was the thing I was gonna mention. I remember people were very into Stranger Things, this show on Netflix, and a lot of people would talk about it and do you like it or whatever, and I'm always the kind of like older person that's kind of grumpy now, and I'm just kind of like, yeah, it's fine. I mean, is it really that good? It's just this, I don't know. I think it's like the third or fourth season. I think it was the third season where it was just like legitimately 80s throwback season. And I just wasn't into it. It just was very like cheap and not creative. And it was like, I don't need this. Like, I don't.
Did you like The Americans?
I did like The Americans, but I liked The Americans in a way in which it was kind of like Mad Men. It's almost like a kind of historical narrative of sorts, where it's like, it's not like trying to be like, I don't know, like in Stranger Things, it was like, let's go like rollerblading and we're going to listen to, A Flock of Seagulls, One Hit Wonder and Western, whatever. It's not like that kind of, very obvious on the nose. With those kinds of shows, it was more of like, no, we're literally telling a story in this time, and in this time, with a kind of realism of sorts. So I kind of like, my mind shifts a little bit, and I guess, I don't know, maybe it's because it's like a serious drama or things like that. But I think there's some cheap things there. It's like, like Metallica still keeps putting an album out every 5 or 6 years. And like, I still think Metallica is still the biggest metal band ever. But it just doesn't, it's just them trying to do Master of Puppets and the Black Album over and over and over again. It's just like, you guys did it and it's great. And those albums are great. Don't keep trying to make that album anymore. But I think it's because there's a kind of monetization of that. Right? Like people like that stuff. And when you see new bands or other things that try to rip off of them or other people before them, it's like, you're right. Everyone's influence, or there's a nod to this. That's cool. But I think when it clearly sounds like this is a ripoff of, fill in the blank, I don't think we should. I think when it's like, when you're incentivized to do it, whether with status or with popularity or with money, I don't think that's helpful. Because that's just really pushing something that feels kind of stuck. And I think there's a lot of films and shows and music that does that. And it's like, no, maybe we don't reward. I mean, I'm going to get a lot of heat for this maybe, but like, I don't, except for like the diehards out there, like, I don't need another Marvel film. I don't need, we've had 32 of those films or whatever. I don't need another one. Like, it's fine. Like, it's fine. Like,
well, they're starting to not do well now, right?
Yeah, because it's old. It's just, they're not really.
Well, that's where I
different.
think, and so that's what my next answer to your, I said it's complicated. My next answer is going to really lean into like personality, which is, I mean, you're speaking from your perspective with your, with your personality, and you nailed it. You said a lot of people are into this. So, one of the things, I get into a little bit in the book, not too deeply, but towards the end when I'm talking about like the progress stuff, and people just vary in how comfortable they are with change.
Yeah.
And some people really are, and you might just be on that side of the continuum that's like, I'm fine with nostalgia, but it's got to be pretty subtle because I prefer the balance to be towards like doing something really creative and new. But a lot of people aren't, that way. A lot of people are somewhere in the middle, but there are people on like the extreme other side where they're extremely nostalgic and they really are very conservative. And I don't mean politically, I mean like conservative in their approach to living. They like their patterns. I've interacted, doing some of this work, I've interacted with a lot of people who are, not all collectors are this way, but there are people that their hobbies, their interests are such where they really like things to be a particular way. And, that's what brings them happiness, right? That, they don't want a lot of change. And, and then I think, and then like I said, on the other end there's the people that are really, really on the bleeding edge of like, they are easily bored by anything that seems slightly repetitive. Most people aren't that way either. Most of us are somewhere in the middle and finding, that's why, I think it's hard for like companies can pull the nostalgia lever, but can also and definitely make some money. Clearly, it's a very powerful marketing tool. And it's a popular aesthetic preference, and it's a cyclical thing too. Like it's not, we're talking about movies and music, but like if you look at a lot of fashions, if you look at a lot of architectural styles, if you just the way things look, people's aesthetic preferences, they tend to be one way you're thinking about it is like people. I don't know how old you are, but I'm 47. People my age, middle age is when people start to get to the positions in organizations in which they get to call the shots. And so you get this thing where it's like, oh, this is the stuff this is the stuff I grew up with. And maybe if you're good, if you're creative, if you're clever, hopefully you're going to do something fresh with it. But often you get this nod to like, well, this is the things, these are the things that influenced me. You definitely, as we pointed out, you definitely see this in film. And some people really, it's very, very, it's not subtle at all. Like J.J. Abrams, like when he did Star Wars, right? It's like clearly like you could see his love for a particular type of movie. He put his own stamp on it. But it's like you can see like, okay, like he's at the age where he's getting to be the creator of this content, and you see this kind of happen a lot in terms of these cycles. But where I would say that, I know you didn't say, you kind of held back from saying harmful. I think most of the time that sort of nostalgia is harmless in the sense that honestly, a lot of entertainment content is not great. Like a lot, we all have our guilty pleasures or whatever, but it's funny because it's like, we have this, like you were talking about bias, like we have this bias. It's like, people will think that, oh man, music used to be really good, and now like everything I listen to is garbage. But if you actually go back and like, so I listened to a lot of alternative music in the 90s. That was my scene. There was a lot of crappy music back then. We've just pulled out the greats. Like we've and that's kind of how we've pulled out the things that we really like that we thought were good, and you forget that at that time there was a lot of music that was like, oh, like Pearl Jam already did that. We don't need another one of these or whatever. So I think that's a permanent. It's a permanent state of the human condition. Like there's a good portion of entertainment content that's just not that original. It's just not that creative. But I do think you're right that there's something about, and some of it might be like nostalgia intersects with these weird things like finance, in the sense that like the Marvel movie is a good example. And you hear about how studios don't want to take risks, because they spend $200 million on a movie. Like a lot of times I watch a movie and, I'll see something I really like, and, come to find out that was like a $20 or $30 million. Like that still seems like a lot of money, but it's like they were more willing to like try something new with a lower budget. I kind of wish they would just, they would make more. I like a lot of sci-fi action stuff. I kind of wish they would just make more like lower budget, more creative movies instead of being like, every movie has to be a $200 a $200 million production, because when they do that, yeah, they're they become very risk averse, and they lean heavily on what worked in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think I saw one movie that comes to mind is Beau is Afraid by Ari Aster that had Joaquin Phoenix, and I loved that film. I thought it was great, and it didn't do very well because it's a weird fucking movie. I mean, it's a weird movie. Like, and I get, and it's 3 hours, and it's just like, yeah, I get why people didn't like it, but I think it was well done. I think it was great, but I think you're right. I think it does go to people's preferences, and I think that there's a kind of like back and forth with this, right? With media, of like, what are labels or studios or whatever? There's an influence they have on like the population, but then there's also like what the population likes and influences them. There's like this kind of weird reciprocal kind of thing that happens. And like, I mean, I'm pretty sure a lot of people watched Oppenheimer because it was the whole Barbie Oppenheimer thing last summer, right? I mean, like most people would not go and watch that movie if it wasn't whatever the thing that created out of whatever. And vice versa. People that were seeing Oppenheimer were probably not going to go see Barbie, but both films did well and both people are happy and whatever. But sometimes that happens, right? And I think it's just like, because the fifth Indiana Jones movie did not do well, right? I mean, it did okay, but it was like, it's like another thing where it's just like, okay, like I don't want to see 80-year-old Harrison Ford trying to do stuff he did like in Temple of Doom. Like it just doesn't work. It doesn't. I mean, I didn't mind the film. Everyone that I knew hated it, but I actually didn't mind it. But you could see what was there, and it was, I don't know, I thought it was better than the fourth one. But you know what I mean? Like it's just stuff like that. It's like, yeah, we don't need to have a spin-off or whatever. It's just I don't know. There's certain things that we can have it there. But I think you're right that it is, at the end of the day, when I have these conversations, I get to this point in the conversation, I'm always left unfulfilled. But it is a kind of like, yeah, everyone's different and everyone likes different things. And I totally agree with that. Like it's a totally real thing.
Yeah.
My question is like, why is like so many people have that kind of, I don't want to say personality, but enough to like something to make it popular or whatever, if it's feeding on a nostalgic thing. And I think it's a hard question to answer. You never know what can be kind of, take off or things like that. But it is interesting.
Well, it's hard to go from because I'm just like winging it here as far as a media critic. Like, it's hard to go from the like psychological science on nostalgia, which is more about like what happens when people revisit personally cherished memories themselves and how that influences their cognition, motivation, and behavior. And then obviously like connect that to this, multi-dimensional idea of like an entertainment experience, which is driven by a lot of different variables. The Indiana Jones thing was, that was a great example because sometimes nostalgia flops. I mean, sometimes it's like, and sometimes the nostalgia, like I said, the nostalgia that works is often people don't even detect that it was nostalgic to begin with. An example I think of is the John Wick franchise, which is, there's, of course, now there's like four movies, so it's not like it's a new thing in itself, but they've all been very successful, I believe. And there's a lot of mixing of nostalgia in there of like, comic book, anime, old school kind of action movies, martial arts movies. There's all this stuff, but it's done in a way, and this is where I think nostalgia is at its best. It's done in a way where it's like, okay, here's a tribute, here's a nod to all these different genres that influenced us as creators, but then we're doing it in doing something new. And I think, just like I said, there's a continuum. Some people on extreme both ends. Most of us are somewhere in the middle, and we want that mix. It's like we get bored easy. We don't just want the same thing. But if something's too out there, it doesn't like it unnerves a lot of people, right? It's like, now maybe you're one of those people that are like, yeah, make it as weird as possible, and that's fine with me. There are definitely people like that. But most people are somewhere where it's like, okay, I want new content. Like I'm bored with this. So, and that can be, I think a good example, and you can see like the mug I'm drinking out of. Nintendo is a company that I think does this really well because they've got these franchises that there's a continuity, there's a through line, right? There's a new Mario game, there's a new Zelda game. But they often do things either through the interface with the way they do the console. Like if you remember the Wii had the motion controls, and then like the Switch has got this cool thing where you can play it as a handheld or dock it for your TV. But like the new Zelda game that was really, really popular.
It's amazing. It's an amazing game.
Yeah, it's a great game. Like, but it was like, okay, there was this like, this is the Zelda world, but then they had this cool, they borrowed from this, like people like these building mechanics too, right? And so I think that that's to me like nostalgia done well. It's like people don't just want to they don't just want to play another Zelda game that's exactly like Ocarina of Time. They want something to feel true to that sacred sense of this is why I love this world and like being in this world. But I also want like to do something new and something fresh. And I think that, and that's not just updated graphics. You see this a lot. Like, I don't know if you play video games, you see this a lot with like, they just make games and they just update the graphics.
Yeah. It's just not.
There's a certain level of like, okay, if you really love that game and you want to play it in HD, because it hurts your eyes to play the old version. Great. But a lot of times what makes the game successful is if they change the mechanics, they make it more modern. And so that's using progress, right? Like that's obviously like a very narrow entertainment version of progress, but better controls in a video game is progress. There's actually really, really popular, a lot of indie studios are making like 16-bit looking game, retro graphic games, which I enjoy a lot. But like in a lot of ways, they're a lot more fun to play than the old games because they have like the modern things of like, you can save the game, right? I mean, it just, those sort of enhancements, and then they put in new elements of it to where it feels like, okay, this is definitely like a modern game, but it's got this like cool, like pixel style animation. So to me, that's where nostalgia, it's like can really be innovative. It can really be like fresh because it's like, yeah, you're doing something like that. And you can obviously see your love, your passion, your nostalgia come through this product. But now you're doing you're also, the best way to pay tribute to something nostalgically, in my opinion, is to take it to that next level, right? Is to be like, okay, the torch has been passed to me, in culture, torch is passed to my generation, but we can't just do what they did in the past. We got to keep moving it forward. And I think that's kind of the best. Like I said, I'm not an art critic or a media critic, but like experientially, that's where I feel the most fulfilled with nostalgia is when it does that. But yeah, some people just want to rewatch Friends. You're right. Like
yeah.
And,
I think with the John Wick example, I think that's the closest thing we'll get to like the original Matrix with Keanu Reeves and like that. I think people kind of sort of like, I think that's why they can like really, that's not the only reason, but I think it's like the closest thing we'll get to it and people like it. And I mean, that's why I like it.
And they'll probably overdo it, right? It'll probably live past its prime. And
yeah, that's fine. I mean, there's a fifth one in the works and, maybe it'll be good, but I don't know. And I think you're right. The Zelda thing is a great example of that because I mean, it still keeps the kind of like 8-bit, 16-bit, whatever. But it's the story and it's the open world aspect of it, and it's all the kind of mechanics of things are so much easier, and there's more things you can do in that world. I mean, when Breath of the Wild came out, I mean, I thought it was probably one of the best games I ever played. I mean, it was amazing, and the new one that's out, I haven't. I started playing it when it came out, Tears of the Kingdom. And it just like expands on Breath of the Wild. And, every time there's that piece of it, it's like, ooh, can you do the follow-up album? Like that was, you're touching on something real special here. Can you do that? And I remember I think I played like 15 hours of Tears of the Kingdom. And I had to stop because I was not being like a responsible adult. Like I was like staying up late. I was like, I couldn't get up in the morning. I was like spending 6 hours on the weekend. I was like, I cannot do this. But it's really good. Yeah. It's really good. The story's captivating. It's a lot of fun. And it doesn't need to have, God of War graphics and play. Like, I mean, God of War's fine, but like, it's just, there's something like, this is super familiar. I mean, I'm also older, so I remember playing on the original Nintendo and Super Nintendo. So it's like, wow, this feels great. But then there's also like, the story and what you can do. And there's just the possibilities feel kind of limitless. And so it's just like, wow, like this is like hitting all the points I want at the same time. And it's like, it's great.
Right.
Like that's what makes it, I think, why people like it. But so I would agree. That's a great example of like, how it is kind of forward moving. It takes things that work and it keeps building and building onto it. And, and I mean, Nintendo's got a great brain trust of people over there, doing stuff.
I mean, they really have it, have it dialed in with that.
Mhm.
And the other thing I'll say about that is, I think nostalgia also works really well when it has this intergenerational or cultural continuity component. It's like, you can play something and share it with your kids, younger generations, and it be like, okay, this was the thing that got me into this, series, the old school Zelda games. And then it's like, but then they love the new ones. And, and so there's like it's a common language. Nostalgia can help create that common language. It's like, we're going to have differences, generational differences, in terms of like what we're into. But if you find something that hits both, Pixar used to be really good at this. I don't know. Like I've heard that their new movies aren't so great, but I don't know. Like I quit watching them so my kids are adults now, but when, we would go watch all these movies, and I remember like they were good at like having like, this is entertaining for an adult. Like there's messages in here, there's themes in here that like pull at adults like heartstrings, and really good storytelling. But also the kids are laughing and they're excited, and so like there definitely are like creators that are very, very good at those kind of connection across generational connection points. Whether they're nostalgic or not, like they're just it's just like it's good to like, be able to target multiple audiences and win. But I feel like nostalgia, like there is an element of nostalgia that's like that. It's like shared, like passing down those memories, and then it's exciting. Like this is an extreme example for like the fandom stuff we were talking about, but this was a long time ago. But when I was a young adult, I went to a Star Trek convention. And I like Star Trek, but I wouldn't normally go to a Star Trek convention. I'm not like that diehard. But I won tickets on this. You remember back in the day when people used to listen to radio stations and you would call in and request songs and things like that. Well, they were doing like a giveaway for tickets, and I won tickets. And I went to the Star Trek convention, and it was really one thing that I thought was really cool about it was like, so this is at the time in which I think like Deep Space Nine. This was the end of, I think maybe the Next Generation had ended, but this was kind of in that time period, and it was cool because there were like older fans there, and they were really into like the original show, and the kind of like old movies, and like with Will Shatner as Captain Kirk, you know what I mean? And then there were like at the time, the newer fans were the people that were into the Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. And there was a lot of like mixing of like generations and people like it legitimately seemed like, because I was in the younger group, it generally seemed like the older crowd was very, very excited to see this carry on. Like, oh, there's a new generation of fans. Like this isn't going to die with us. I mean, not to get too existential about it, but this is something that is going to bring people together in future generations. And so that's one of the things that's kind of cool about like those sort of like fandom cultures. Is like, I was talking to a journalist just the other day. She must have been in her early to mid 20s, and she was going on about like she's getting ready to go play Dungeons and Dragons. And I was like, I mean, that's old. Like I remember people playing that like back in when I was in high school and middle school and stuff like that. So that's kind of an exciting component about like nostalgia is, which I guess is like independent of like how innovative or creative it is, but just that passing down of culture from generation to generation, that continuity across time, and then seeing what like the younger generations do, see what spin they put on it and what direction they take it. I think is really neat.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. The intergenerational piece is, I think, somewhat is what kind of keeps a lot of those things alive, which is, it's interesting. It is interesting to see different generations have different perspectives at different points of a world or whatever creation it is. It's really, really interesting. So let's talk about the self. So you talk about nostalgia as important for self-concept. You talk about, kind of this self-continuity that nostalgia gives. And you also talk about self-esteem. So there's all these different things here. So I guess a few things about this is, how are you kind of defining the self, and how do you see nostalgia as important for the self concept, and then and then about self-esteem, which I'm curious about your thoughts there for nostalgia.
Yeah. So some scholars use the term like the self system. I know there is like a philosophical and even empirical debate about the self, and there are people that even say there is no self and things like that. I'm not sure like how personally I don't find that discussion super like useful, a strong term, but it's like whether or not like there obviously isn't like an organ that there obviously isn't like this is the self, but clearly the human brain and its advanced complexity has some kind of like self system in which there's structures and neurological structures and processes that are heavily involved in the creation, retrieval, maintenance of autobiographical memories and identities and related concepts that allow us to move forward day to day and feel like we're like the same person over time. And in fact, somebody who is selfless in the sense of like if somebody had a dramatic personality change from day to day, or like one day this was their favorite food and another day they hated that food, or one day they went to their job and they're like, why am I doing this? We would that would get to the point of potentially being like pathological, right? We'd say there's something very, very disjointed about them. So wherever people fall in this idea of what the self is, clearly there's something about the human experience that's self-referential, that involves self-consciousness and the ability to organize our goals and preferences and interests in a continuous way that allows us to grow, like to move forward, to be like, I'm training for a marathon today. I'm training for it next week too. I'm going to keep doing this because this is like somehow how I conceptualize myself. So that's really how I see the self, as like the self concept is our answer to the question, who am I? And it's shaped by personality, shaped of course by life experiences, the memories we experience. It's shaped of course by a lot of things that we don't control, like we don't control our genetics, we don't control where we grew up and where we went to school and things like that, and all those like environmental inputs. But then there is also this like what I'd consider like an agentic or creative process of the self, which is the kind of back and forth between those inputs, and our own like developing like experimentation and desires of like what we want to do with our lives. So like an obvious example is when you're a kid, you might say, hey, maybe I'll try playing a musical instrument. Oh, that didn't go so well. Oh, I fell in love with it. Now I found my passion. Or parents often do this. Like we try to encourage our kids to try different things to figure out what it is that like, captures their interest and imagination, figure out where their talents lie. And then ideally like lean into that and try to invest in those things. And so that's really how I see the self. It's like that who am I and what are my priorities and goals. And of course, there's a whole area of moral psychology that gets into, the kind of like the ethics or the morality of the self, of trying to be a good person. And, or like empathy towards others is partially like determined and by our ability to like imagine how that would feel for us, right? Like that self-referential component. So that's a long way of saying, like, I think the self is a sort of complicated system that really involves like our self-consciousness and our awareness of self. Self-esteem is essentially like at a simplest form of self-evaluation. Like, do I see myself as, as being positive or negatively valenced in some domain? Like people often think of like global or generalized self-esteem, which is just your overall self-evaluation. But then there's a lot of research too on self-esteem can be domain specific too. What I mean by that is you might say, well, in this particular area of life, I think I'm really like, I have a very high evaluation myself, and that's good because that matters a lot to me. It's like very central. So, if you prize yourself in being a good student and you get A's, then you might say like, oh, that boosts my academic self-esteem. You go into the gym and play a game of basketball and you're horrible about it. Maybe that lowers your athletic esteem, but maybe you don't care because you're like that category, that domain's not that central. So a lot of the way our self-esteem is developed, maintained, or threatened, I think relates to this, the extent to which we feel positive or negative about our performance or our abilities in the domains in which we think are key to are central to our self concept. So we can get into the controversies of the self-esteem like stuff if you want, because I think there's some interesting stuff there. But at some basic level, we want to feel good about ourselves, right? And so the way nostalgia comes into all this is nostalgic, at least personal, what we call personal nostalgia, our own cherished autobiographical memories and our like longing to reconnect with them, is often very useful in times in our lives in which we are looking or we're faced with difficult choices and we're not, we feel uncertain about like who we are, what our priorities are in life. We feel lonely or detached in some way. Life feels meaningless. And we're like, well, who am I? What do I care about? Who do I want to be? Like this concept of my ideal self or my future self. And nostalgic memories, because they're these cherished memories, they can really help us focus on, okay, this is a time in life that I liked who I was then. Like it was really fulfilling and I had these great experiences. Typically they involve relationships. So, a lot of nostalgic memories are about relationships. And when you're in experiences in which you feel like maybe you're chasing things that are materialistic or status oriented, and they're kind of shifting your focus away from these things, and you're trying to figure out, well, why am I miserable? These types of memories often like can help put you back on course and be like, oh, like I should spend more time like, thinking about family and friends, because that's actually who I want to be. Like that's actually what brings me meaning and fulfillment. And so nostalgia is very much like can help us like track that self story and remind us of what we care about, and also give us the kind of confidence that we can, I think one of the reasons when we were kind of making jokes about like people want to, they love Star Wars because when they were kids, it was really exciting or whatever. I think a lot of those kinds of experiences aren't really even directly about the media content. Like it's a gateway, it's a connection point to like, we're trying to figure out like, we're trying to reconnect with that sense of like energy, like that sense of like freedom or like possibility or like risk, the willingness to take risks or it's like when we get older, we kind of stuck in these patterns, and it's like we are trying, perhaps ironically, because we're revisiting, like you said, we were just revisiting these old things, but there might be an irony there in that what we're really trying to do is reconnect with that feeling of like, but at that time, this felt new. This felt like, and I think a lot of times that's what nostalgia is also helping us do, is it's helping the self grow. Like we don't just like, we want stability, but we also want to feel like I've become more than I was 20 years ago. And the funny thing being that like sometimes revisiting those memories from 20 years ago can help us reconnect with that like youthful spirit to become more, like be like, oh yeah, like when I was this age, like I'm not going to get on a skateboard now, but when I was that age, I remember I did something new and it was risky and it took nerve to do it. Well, maybe that's the kind of nerve I need to rekindle to try a new career path or something like that. And so I think that's where nostalgia not only can like help us like boost our sense of like self and like our self-esteem, but also can help us like grow, like help the self expand into new spaces, into new directions.
Yeah, I like the continuity piece, because that really, I kind of, I view the self as a type of illusion. I don't think there's an actual self. I think we're a conglomeration of different aspects of who we are over time. I do think, though, that there is a continuity of what it means to be us. So I think nostalgia is probably a important, like, lubricant for that, I think.
Well, and we fear losing. I mean, like, one of our fears is cognitive decline. The idea of like losing that sense of self. It's like, the idea of like, well, not being able to remember loved ones or who you care about, or a dramatic personality change. Like that's terrifying at some level because of that continuity piece you're talking about.
Yeah. The self-esteem thing I'm curious about because we can get into it a little bit, I guess, but my understanding is that self-esteem has a kind of up and down relationship. I think, it's been around for a while, and then there's a lot of good research on it that, kind of shows that, like, it's probably not what we think it is. At best, it's very gray and unclear. And some people say it's, complete bullshit as far as a concept. And then there's a kind of like, I think a lot of the times when things, not always, but I think with this one in particular, when things kind of in academia, when there's a lot of research done on it, and then we find that it's, we can't say as conclusively, or there's too much noise, or it's mixed variability, it then kind of leaks out to like, pop psychology. And then it's like everyone goes and runs with it. I feel like self-esteem sort of has done that a little bit, but there was a good review paper a couple of years ago, which kind of details all this. It's some folks out of Pepperdine. It's Aramo and Levy, I think that's who it is. Where they kind of just track like, how it started and, the kind of cycle of it. And there's other papers out there as well about, self-esteem just isn't a really good construct to try and talk about how do we love ourselves. So I don't know, how do you, I mean, we don't have to get super in the weeds of it, but what do you think about like criticisms or claims against the idea of self-esteem being an actual kind of construct?
Yeah. So I think you hit some good points. I mean, I think one challenge, especially in, Western culture, I suppose, is the self-esteem concept really got, when you mentioned pop psychology, it really got turned into this like enterprise of, well, if we just boost everyone's self, if we just make everyone like love themselves, like affirmate, this kind of affirmation culture, then that's going to lead to these outcomes. And Will Storr wrote the author Will Storr wrote a really good book on this called Selfie a number of years ago. He kind of talked about like the sort of even the political history of how like the self-esteem movement became something that both on the left and right people liked because on the like progressive side, this is gonna like lead to all these like kind of positive outcomes. If we can just enhance kids' self-esteem, they're gonna do much better at school and so forth. And on the conservative side, it was like, this is a really like affordable intervention. It's not, it seems like it's not going to cost much. And so like, why not? But then that turned out to be at best like nothing, at worst disastrous, in the sense that like we promoted a culture in which people use words like participation trophies. Like we promoted a culture in which like, we should just tell people to love themselves, as opposed to what I think a more reasonable analysis of self-esteem is, to the extent that it's anchored, like to self-evaluation is anchored to reality at some level. Like it's good to feel good about yourself. Like when you're doing well, like the examples I provided, like if you want to find out if you actually are a good athlete, and that can be good to get that kind of information. But there is, so that's just to say the utility of self-esteem. The main thing I know, I should say that I know about it is, the last I checked, the sort of general consensus was that low self-esteem is bad. Like it's an indicator of like depression, right? Like if you hate yourself, if you think you're a loser, like that's not going to probably lead to a lot of great outcomes. So it's like very, very low self-esteem is bad. Very, very high undeserved self-esteem we think of as being narcissistic, right? Like extreme self-love. But there seems to be something to like, obviously people valuing themselves and liking themselves, whatever you call that, is motivating, right? Like to feel like you're a worthy person. And then there's like, there's all sorts of spin-off literatures. Like there's the intrinsic self kind of idea, which is like a self-esteem based on just a more moral perception that everyone's deserves, everyone's a person of worth, like everyone's a person of value, and you should feel that way about yourself. And it doesn't mean you're good in any particular thing, but like you're a human being who deserves to be
Yeah.
affirmed in some way. And, I get that, but that's the reason I was like kind of criticizing the Western cultural, the more narcissistic side of it, because it definitely became like, I felt like it became more of a, especially in the education psychology space, it definitely became more of a like, oh, this is going to be a way to like produce all these outcomes of just affirming children. And, turns out that, at least from what I understand, like, that wasn't, not only was that not successful, that was in many ways it made people falsely like fragile, and it would have been like, one argument, for instance, is it would have been better to focus on like self-regulation or self-control, like actually the things that lead to better. It's like getting the causal area the other direction, right? It's like it shouldn't be self-esteem comes first and then you'll get good at things. You should get good at things, and then you should feel the reward of the fulfillment that comes from achievement. And so like it's like they got it backwards or something. But I mean, I don't know if that's what you meant by all that, but
yeah, no, I mean, I think the new iteration of this is self-compassion, and I think that, like, look, I mean, I'm not again, I'm not the person that needs to be the that is the gatekeeper of what words are used. I just think that there should be an accuracy. I agree. I think that there's maybe either we have words already or terms already, or we don't know quite the extent of it. Of yes, we want to feel good about ourselves. If you call that self-esteem, if you call that self-compassion, fine. I think that based on the scientific literature we have, it's just kind of not conclusive about that as an actual construct, right? Where, as distinct from something like, intelligence, right? Right. Where we know that's a real thing, even though people claim it isn't, right? But we know that's a real thing. We know personality is a real thing. And, even if you can take the best literature on, the big five or whatever, but you can debate in, how many aspects of conscientiousness are there? And there's like 17 different ways to talk about them, but they're really kind of the same thing. Like, that's fine. And I kind of find self-esteem, again, I'm not close to this literature, but as something like that is, we probably have other things or terms for it. I don't think everything needs a new term and then a whole industry that's selling, those books that like those self-help books that are like, I feel like there's 20 of those books out there and they're all the same book. It's just like we're kind of repackaged a little differently. This stuff kind of sells. It's like what people want to hear, right? At the end of the day, I think your point is right. How do we have a way to kind of think well or positively about ourselves, but based in reality? I think that's definitely an important thing to have. We can get existential here. We can kind of land on this. So I love existential thought. And there's a couple years I taught existential theory and therapy for grad students, and I really enjoyed doing that. So I'm very sympathetic to existential practice. So we're all gonna die. This is I was actually just saying this week. We're all gonna die. You can't really love or appreciate life unless you have a concept of ending somehow. Otherwise, there's no kind of juxtaposition that gives it a kind of good contrast, which is strange. But it sucks. Like, nobody wants to think about not being here anymore, right? And we hope it's far away in the future for most of us. But that's still a hard thing to handle. I mean, philosophers have thought about this. Clinicians have thought about this. Different types of people are thinking about death and dying abstractly and conceptually. So how does nostalgia help us with this idea that we're going to die and we have an expiration date? But further to that, how is it not self-denial, or how is it not avoiding the thinking about death or dying? obviously you don't want to, ruminate on it,
Right.
and be perseverative on it. But yeah, what's the kind of balance or sweet spot there of how nostalgia can help us to understand or cope with the idea that we'll eventually die?
So that's the question that actually got me interested in
Oh,
nostalgia to
interesting.
begin with. Many years ago, when I was in graduate school, I was interested in existential psychology, in particular the writing of Ernest Becker
Hmm.
and the denial of death, and these ideas of what does it mean to be an organism that, as far as we know, is uniquely aware of the inevitability of our mortality, right? So all the things you said, we know we're going to die, and that's not, it's not good news.
Nope.
Um, but and I kind of went down an interesting path with this because initially my thinking was kind of what you were saying. Like it was this like I had a very defensive view of nostalgia. And so my basic hypothesis, when I first started doing this research was being able to mentally time travel means being able to think about the future, which is cool in a lot of ways because that gives us goals and so forth. But it also means we can think about death, which is a major bummer, can cause a considerable amount of anxiety. Of course, that's not productive. So we have to, in some way, like move forward, or suppress it, or whatever. Take different forms. That was kind of that was Becker's analysis, and his analysis really was we use cultural worldviews, as a way to deal with this, like as a way to weave ourselves into a more transcendent story. To be like, well, yeah, I'm going to die, but like I'm going to live on in the afterlife, or I'm part of I'm part of something that's bigger than me, something transcendent, and it doesn't totally eliminate the pain and mortality, but maybe it like reduces the sting enough to where I can like move forward with my life and not live paralyzed by existential anxiety. So what I was thinking was like, okay, we can think about the future, and that can make us anxious, but maybe our ability to time travel, um, also is why we think about the past, or maybe that anxiety that comes from thinking about the future. Like we use our same ability to time travel to solve that problem, like by going backwards. And so my original hypothesis was when people think about their death, they'll become more nostalgic as a way to like remind themselves, like they've lived a meaningful life, and they've had all these different experiences there, and um, that um, that death will kind of undermine that sense of like mortality will kind of undermine that sense of meaning. That I'll be like, oh man, like I'm just all this, I'm just gonna die, and then like and that'll decrease meaning. But then we'll look backwards and be like, oh yeah, but I've had all these experiences, and like that's made life precious and fulfilling, and that'll kind of make me less anxious. And that's originally what I was testing, and we found support for that. But then it was interesting that you could imagine that being consistent with a very what I would call defensive view of nostalgia, which is
Mm.
yeah, it's helpful at reducing anxiety, but really it's avoiding. Like like I don't know if you use this word or not, but it's kind of like an avoidance. It's like it's making it to where it's distracting me from death. I can think about the past, which is distracting me from my fear of the future. But that was what I originally thought. And maybe there's some value to that. Maybe sometimes avoidance can be good. Like it's not good to sit around and ruminate about death. If I can think about all these great memories and that
Mm.
makes me happy, and then I just move forward, there are some benefits to that. But then, really many years later, collecting lots of nostalgic narratives where we had people share memories with us, and doing other types of experimental studies where we induced nostalgia, where we induced like anxiety, where we did these types of things, I started to change my view where nostalgia isn't just a defense, it isn't just an avoidance of our existential fears. It's a negotiation with them, and oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes a constructive one, which is I think so for example, if a lot of older adults, their nostalgic memories, they will say things like, looking back at this, thinking about my daughter's wedding or the birth of my grandchild or whatever, it gives me hope for the future. Like it has this like inspirational quality. They're not avoiding their like future mortality. They're like expanding their horizon, their picture of it. They're like, oh, there's the next generation will carry on the things that I care about, which I don't think is just you could say that's defensive, but there's also something that seems like expansive and about it. It makes people more like generative. It makes them want to, because when I think of defensive, I think of retraction. Like people like, it's comforting, but you're pulling away. But it seems like really a lot of times nostalgia like pushes people out. Like it's like, oh, I want to do more for my community. I want to do more for my family. I want to do something that leaves the world better than I found it. And so that's where my view started to change. Of nostalgia is not just a psychological defense that helps reduce negative affect or anxiety, but it's also like an inspiring or growth-oriented sort of resource that helps us, recognize that we're part of something, that was here before us and will be, ideally be here beyond us. And that while we're here, like we can be thankful and that we got this chance and we got the shot to be here at all. And we can we can do what we can to make a little bit of a positive difference in the world. And that's where I see like the more like existential, like the positive, like existential, like positive psychology. There's like an existential psychology that's very like, more like defensive sort of psychology. But that's where I like I shifted more towards a positive psychology of nostalgia when I started to see how people were really using nostalgia and how it was actually making them hopeful and grateful and making them think beyond themselves.
Yeah, it sounds like you're touching on a lot of themes there about the idea of this existential agency, right? How we can have this meaningful life with sense of urgency. The thing that I've said a few times before is, I'm not so much when I've thought about this, right? I think about dying all the time, which sounds very terrible.
You need to watch more Friends and Star Wars.
I need to watch more Friends.
Then you will want to die.
I actually hate Friends. I hate Friends. I know that's blasphemous. It's, you know what it is? It's the laugh track for me. I can't get over that. It's just so.
I just never got into like the sitcom, like really most.
Me neither. Me
those
neither.
Things.
Yeah, no, I'm more of the like Sopranos, The Wire kind of. When we hit that form of TV, that's where I was all in.
Yeah, same. I prefer that.
But yeah, I think about death in the abstract a lot, and I mean, I love living very much, and I love experiencing so many things. And there's a point where that's not going to happen, and I will be forgotten, and no one will remember me in a lot of ways, and no one will remember all the things I did and how I spent this time. And that doesn't make me depressed. It just makes me. It doesn't make me nervous. It just makes me more. I have more urgency, and I have more appreciation for everything that I'm doing, because I never really know when it's the last time. And all that said, when I thought about, am I afraid of dying? Is that what it is? I certainly don't want to die, but it's more of time. Like I don't have. What is it that I'm not going to be able to do? Why the fear of death, I guess? And it's like, well, no, it's really, I just want more experiences.
Right.
And I don't want to not have the time or the energy or the ability, even when I'm, let's say ostensibly I'll be alive, but I'm, 75 years old and I'm not going to be able to do many things anymore. Then that's different. Life looks different in some ways, but it's that piece of time. I don't feel I have enough time, which is really what it is. And so it's an interesting thing of like, well, how do you? I mean, I know what I do for myself, but generally, how does nostalgia help us live a life of a type of urgency? Not like I got to hurry up and finish this, but this urgency of things are precious and time is short and life is very fragile in some ways, and it is a gift. How does nostalgia help us with this existential agency?
I remember during the pandemic, this became, especially I would say the early part of the pandemic, when people we really didn't know, like, how deadly is this? How contagious is it?
Mm-hmm.
Should we be like washing our groceries?
Yeah.
Remember all of the things and I think there really was a sense of like we just don't know, and so it was very anxiety provoking, especially in the context of you know one of the finding one big finding in psychology is that when people are like awaiting electric shock, for instance, or like when people are going through something that causes fear or anxiety, they like to be around other people. And so there's something weird about a pandemic, which the thing that would be comforting in an anxiety provoking time is the thing that's anxiety provoking, which is other people, right? Because they might give you COVID. And so I remember that time being like a really, really good example of nostalgia in which people had this sense of like, not just like, oh, am I going to get COVID and die? I don't mean that so much. I mean, some people thought that, but I mean, this sense of like, how's the world like, am I ever going to be able to have the time I had before, like the freedom to be able to do things like how, has the world really changed in a dramatic way? People were rewatching the movie Contagion. It's like is society going to be totally different after this? Like, is this going to be like the Black Death or something? And that was the reason I'm bringing up that example is because it did have this like time element of like what people became very nostalgic in the period of time. Probably for a lot of reasons. One, they were stuck at home and they had more time to be nostalgic.
Mm-hmm.
But even like Spotify documented that the streaming of nostalgic music like dramatically increased during the pandemic, even controlling for the fact that just streaming music in general increased during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
But especially nostalgic music, and people really revisiting memories. And my wife and I were doing this very explicitly. We were talking about, wow, why didn't we go to why were we too like busy or lazy to go to that concert? Like we really should have done that. We should have taken advantage of, because time is precious, right? It's this like concept of like, and now we can't go do those things. When the pandemic is over, we're going to prioritize getting out, going out to dinner, going out to breweries, hanging out with friends, doing stuff. And so I think, all that's to say is I think one of the things that nostalgia helps us do when we have these like time related like fears, it's like, have I lost the time to do that? Like, can I not do that anymore? Or is my time limited? Or like, these nostalgic memories will often remind us of like what was precious about that. And at its best can really help us like prioritize that. Like, oh, if we get out of this situation, I should spend since time is limited, I should spend more of it like with loved ones. Like I shouldn't be so worried about all this other nonsense. And so I think when we're dealing with that, like that recognition that we only have so much time, our nostalgic memories help us decide what to focus on and what to privilege. And people did things, they moved closer to family, they changed jobs, we're also creatures of habit. So a lot of people just went, things just went back to the way they were. But I do think there was plenty of examples of people using their nostalgia to be like, well, I don't want to take time for granted after this. And I want to like do things. I mean, travel's been way up post pandemic. People are like, oh, like all the things that, I thought, I'll get around to that someday.
As have the prices have gone up as well.
Right,
So
right.
People have caught on to this.
So I think, it helps us like that recognition that time is limited. Like, it's like, okay, well, how do I want to spend it then? And nostalgic memories can help, enlighten us into that. Like, okay, well, what did I like doing? What are the things that have been the most meaningful to me? And not that I want to necessarily repeat those things exactly, but there's elements of those things that might help me figure out how to prioritize my time going forward.
No, I agree. And I think that's where, a lot of the times these things can be, helpful reminders. So, how do we have finally, when people, read your book or they think about nostalgia, how can we have a healthy relationship individually and collectively with nostalgia? I was kind of the, grumpy old person earlier talking about people, being nostalgic and all these things, right? I'm not against nostalgia by any means. I do it all the time. And I think there's, as you talk about in the book and you talked about here, there's some really great aspects of it. So like for me, how do we find the balance? How do we find a balance as individual people, but also as in our groups, in our society? How do we have a healthy connection to nostalgia?
Yeah, I think the key is, and I've been doing nostalgia research and advising and discussions, around nostalgia for, over 2 decades. And to me, really so a lot of this is informed by the science, but also just like the experience of like these interactions, working with organizations, talking to people like yourself, just getting inputs from all sorts of different types of people who have positive and negative views of nostalgia, have totally different cultural experiences with nostalgia, personal experiences with nostalgia. And, kind of what I've come around to is we all do it and get benefits from it, or most of us do, like somewhat naturally, like it's sort of ingrained in us to be nostalgic. It's like when we're facing a problem, our brains want solutions, and our memories, our cherished memories can like help us, can provide clues to, like figure out what to do. Whether even if it's just as simple as comforting us or not so like anxious, calming us down, so then we can direct our attention to like solving the problem, or more directly, actually providing some useful information for solving that problem. So I think at some level we just do it naturally. But what I think is, we also exercise naturally. We walk around, but we also know like you can really enhance your exercise if you learn if you get a fitness coach or trainer, or like learn how to do proper form when you go to the gym and things like that. And so like that, I think nostalgia, like exercise, I think nostalgia, if we use it more intentionally and surgically, and that can help us learn to avoid some of the pitfalls that you were talking about of like overuse, or doing something that's it's nostalgia, but it's not in a way that's pushing us forward. It can help us avoid that. So as a concrete example, and this is one that I come up against a lot. It's like people will talk about nostalgia at the like kind of broader cultural level, and they'll be like, nostalgia can be a real barrier to progress in the sense of if people just are like, oh, the past was better.
Yeah.
And then, it's like, well, the world is changing, and, then you might think it was better, but you're biased, and better for whom and under what circumstances. And so what I try to think of is when I say intentional is like, if you find yourself making a generalized, like having a generalized attitude, like, oh, everything sucks now and the past was better, it's worth stopping yourself and digging deeper and be like, why do I think that? What specifically about the past is better? Because it turns out, like, if you ask people, if you start asking people more targeted questions, their attitude about the past being better changes pretty quickly. If you said, oh, would you rather, oh, you think the 1950s were better? Okay, if your child was diagnosed with cancer, would you rather have the medicine available at the time, or would you rather have today's medical advances? Oh no, I don't think that part was better. Do you think would you rather raise a daughter then, or would you rather raise a daughter now? Like, do you think that rights for women were so if you start going down these like list of questions, and what you'll find is like a lot of that sentiment becomes directed towards, oh no, there is something about like we sat around together as a family and ate dinner, and now everyone's staring at their phones, or like there are things that are rising to the surface for them because these are the things that they're displeased with today, that tend to make them have a generalized nostalgia. But being more surgical, more intentional, I think, can be like, okay, well, how can you use the specific things you dislike about right now to not make it, oh, everything was better, I don't want to give up progress. How can you use that to be like, well, what's a challenge you're facing today that you think there's wisdom from the past? And like people will do this, like they'll be like, oh, I want to spend more time, and I spend too much time in front of a screen, which I'm guilty of this as well. It's like, and they have this sense of like, oh, when I was a kid, or I remember my grandma would tell me stories about like riding a horse to school, and how they just had free reign of the farm and all of the stuff. It's like, okay, well, you're not going to go back to that. But there is something that you can pull from that. Like, well, yeah, we could all benefit from spending more time in nature, and those nostalgic memories can kind of help you get there. So that's where I think that if you find yourself being nostalgic in a way that's too generalized, too global, I think it's worth like really engaging in some intentional thinking about it and what really are you dissatisfied with. We've actually done some surveys on this. Like for example, even young people, you might find this interesting. Even young people who grew up as digital natives express pretty high amounts, very similar to actually older generations, of nostalgia for a time before everyone was plugged in on like social media and stuff. They're not saying, I want to give up technology, right? Yeah. They're not saying like, I wish I didn't have so many like TV options, or, I wish my video game graphics were crappier. Like, they're not saying that stuff. They're saying there's something about the way our generation is using technology right now that maybe is unhealthy. We don't want to give up the innovation. We want to interact with it we want to find a healthier way. And there's something about the past where people were talking to each other and they weren't distracted by their phones. Maybe there's a lesson to learn from that. So I think that's where we can use nostalgia more as a like surgically, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's important, because a lot of the times people want to make it this kind of black and white thing, and
right,
it's got to be an all or nothing. And I don't think anybody's really saying that. I think that there's a way of which, obviously, there's an individualized perspective of how where people are at with this. But I think that we need to incorporate a lot of different elements and to say, okay, like, how do we use this in ways that are, for some people, really good, and maybe some people it's like, okay, you can't don't live too much back in the past. So I think it really depends on where people are at.
What I say is like pull the past to the present. Like, you don't go backwards. Like, pull from the past. Keep moving forward and like find the threads that you think are useful. As kind of a way of thinking about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, Clay, this was so much fun. I greatly appreciate it. Again, the book is Past Forward: How Nostalgia Can Help You Live a More Meaningful Life. Everyone should go pick it up. Big thanks, man, for coming on. This was such a fun conversation. I really loved it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having the conversation, and I appreciate your insights as well.
Absolutely.